Okay, hello everyone and welcome to another webinar in the series. Today's speaker is Dr. Arthur Rose, who is a senior research fellow at the University of Exeter, UK. His most recent books are Asbestos, The Last Modernist Object in 2020, and with Fred Cooper and Luna Dolezal, COVID-19 and Shame, Political Emotions and Public Health in the UK, with Bloomsbury publication in 2023. And the title of his talk today is Humour and Shame in the Medical Memoir. So welcome to the webinar, Dr. Rose, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Arya, and for everyone, to everyone for coming. In my talk today, I'm going to be looking at some new work that I've been doing on the medical memoir, and particularly I'll be focusing on Adam Kay's 2017 memoir, This Is Going to Hurt, as an exemplar of a particular trend in the medical memoir, wherein situations of great shame are masked with humor. It's my hope that this will provide a starting point for a larger discussion of the role that shame plays within the medical memoir and by extension in medical culture more generally. At the same time, it may help to unpack the features that distinguish the medical memoir from other forms of life writing, and so help us to understand why attending to these texts may be rewarding for participants of the Literature and Science Forum. In a sense, many medical memoirs, even those that are primarily episodic, like This Is Going to Hurt, tend to have an explicit or implicit form of build-up or self-cultivation. Here, they coincide with the larger category of memoir and its affiliate genres, the autobiography, the confession, and other forms of life writing. But while memoirs generally, but not always, refer to a non-fictional life or part thereof, and generally, but not always, recompose that life so it has a form with an aesthetics either of continuity or of fracture, they may remain difficult to define within and against the larger category of life writing, as critics like Ben Yagoda and Thomas Kauser have shown. So for my purposes today, I'll be thinking of the medical memoir much as Linda Gask has described it. As an extended piece of nominally non-fiction writing where the writer tries to make some coherent sense of the transformative process of medical training on the person. In other words, I'll be marking a distinction between those personal non-fictional writings written predominantly by medical professionals and their closest relative, the illness narrative or pathography, which engages the medical world from the position of the patient. Obviously, there are a number of texts that run across these distinctions, Gask's own memoir, The Other Side of Silence, for instance, or Henry Marsh's recent. And finally, these are texts that where there's a medical professional who suffers from an illness. But for the sake of analytic ease, I mean texts that focus on the experiences of the medical professional, and in this way also seek to separate my target text from a broader category of memoir by virtue of its content. Still, it's important to reflect on the broader case of the memoir because, as Yagoda has shown, the genre itself plays a critical role in our understanding both of literature and ourselves, and the literary marketplace. Between 2004 and 2008, Yagoda notes, sales in the US of various subcategories of memoir increased 400%. Memoir became both marketable commodity and a key part of discourses about personal identity. More precisely, as Julie Rack has argued, they turn identities into commodities while also participating in the manufacture of public identities as a reader encounters the life of another within the context of his or her own experience. The 21st century has seen what Rack calls the memoir boom, especially in the United States, where she relates the success of the genre both to forms of affective citizenship or feelings of connection and belonging, and as a salve for a general loss of trust in larger institutions, replacing dependency on institutions with a feeling of truthiness that many memoirs aim to evoke. Truthiness, I should say, as a gloss, is this is a term that is coined by the comedian Stephen Colbert, and it's the sense that truth should be based on gut feeling rather than on facts. So it's this idea that we may not, something may or may not be true, but because we feel it should be true, it becomes imbued with a kind of truthiness. At the same time, as Rak, Yagoda, and others have observed, the success of the memoir seems as much a product of its detractors as its writers. Some 20 years ago, Nancy K. Miller wrote that it is difficult to think of another modern genre that comes in for the kind of rhetorical abuse that memoir seems to inspire. And if such abuse has lessened as memoir has established itself in prominent displays of bookshops, this hasn't made memoir any less significant as an expression both of personal identity and of the marketplace. Importantly, memoir is a genre, and genres are social institutions, even as they are taxonomic identities. And what this means is that when the explosion of memoirs interfaces with the writing doctor, we have two very, very interesting social institutions, the medical institution and the literary marketplace institution, that come into tension with each other, meaning that sparks fly. Perhaps the most obvious way this happens comes about in our expectation that something marked as memoir or autobiography will be factually true. This is what Philippe Lejeune was referring to when he argued some 50 years ago that readers enter into an autobiographical pact with such texts. The paratextual apparatus, or signs like the title, the cover design, the genre descriptor, etc., present us with the evidence that a text is autobiographical, and we, as the reader, agree to read the text on those terms. And cases like James Frey's Million Little Pieces, which came under extreme kind of scrutiny and attack when it was proved that some of it was made up, shows just how much readers invest in this autobiographical pact. But of course, medical writers have to make it clear that they are not simply reproducing existing case histories. Such an action would violate patient confidentiality. So we read these memoirs knowing they are in part made up, while also believing them to be true. This aspiration to a higher truth is facilitated by characters who are often explicitly referred to as synthesized from multiple cases, which helps blur the line between fictional being and representations of real living people. But it also begs a bigger question of what such memoirs are written in order to do. This is part of my current project, so I have no firm answers for this at this point. But I think, apropos Iraq, that the success of the medical memoir may be tangentially related to a general crisis in the belief in medical authority, which was already beginning to be diagnosed in the anti-clinical writings of Ivan Illich in the 1970s, and which in the UK which is where I'm speaking to you from, was consolidated by a series of scandals since the early 90s, like the Bristol heart scandal and the Harold Shipman affair. If this is right, we might read medical memoirs as providing a counterbalance for a distrust in the medical profession with a belief in the truthiness of individual medics confessing. At the same time, and quite apart from the profit incentive, which is scarcely minimal in selling these types of texts, there's also a sense that the recent tranche of medical memoirs in the UK have some political ambitions. And in particular, many of the memoirs written after 2017, from the perspective of junior doctors, like This Is Going to Hurt, have explicit connections to the junior doctor strikes of 2015, 2016, which was when large numbers of the junior doctors in the NHS went out to protest a new contract that was put forward by then Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt. And we really see this not just in This Is Going to Hurt, but also in a text like Rachel Clark's Your Life in My Hands, which are texts that were aimed to, I suppose, show people what it was that the experience was of being a junior doctor, and through that build a sense of solidarity and community support for the junior doctors and their issues. So we also have the sense that the medical memoir often serves as a site of critique for the manipulation of medicine, by both political and economic forces. But it also does something else, which links it to a longer tradition of confessing the self. To confess, writes Paul de Man, is to overcome guilt and shame in the name of truth. It is an epistemological use of language in which ethical values of good and evil are superseded by values of truth and falsehood. This desire for truth, which has been in many ways supplanted by this desire for truthiness that I've been talking about, mobilizes the writer to overcome the shame of sharing of particular instances by sharing it. The explicit and implicit references to shame across the medical memoir proves no exception to this tradition. In revealing this shame, however, writers of medical memoirs also testify to a historical and ongoing use of shame in shaping medical education, medical culture, and medical practice. In this respect, my work on medical memoirs contributes to a much larger project called Shame in Medicine, funded by the Wellcome Trust and led by Luna Dolezal, that aims to research the role of shame in various aspects of health and medicine, including clinical practice, patient experience, and medical education. But why is This Is Going to Hurt so important for what we do? Because it is, I would argue, suffused with shame and uses humor to mask that. So I'll now turn to a more sort of a closer reading of the text itself. This Is Going to Hurt, the memoir, follows Kay over his 6-year career as a junior doctor, told in the form of diary entries that are grouped according to his roles as respectively house officer, SHO, registrar, and senior registrar. The memoir presents an episodic account of Kay's life from 2004 to when he first started his first job as a house officer to 2010, when he decided to leave medicine following a sentinel emotional event involving a patient. Like many such memoirs, it pointedly balances an acknowledgement that personal details, clinical information has been changed with a broader claim that it tells the truth about what it actually means to be a doctor, quote, and a Veruca's and all account of what it's like working on the front line. The truth, then, is something more complicated than a simple presentation of facts. It's far closer to what Raymond Williams might have called a structure of feeling or an atmosphere, through which Kay transmits his sense of the problems facing the NHS, and in particular, the junior doctors who work in its trusts. In part, the atmosphere in Kay's memoir is indelibly bound up with questions of trauma, as Jo Winning has shown in her essay, Trauma, Illness, and Narrative in the Medical Humanities. Spending night shifts that make, quote, Dante look like Disney in an A&E that is, quote, a ship that's enormous and on fire and no one has really taught you how to sail. Kay is regularly, quote, drenched in bodily fluids, not even the fun kind, and has seen things that, quote, scar his retinas to this day. Casual references to the popular examples of trauma, like Stockholm Syndrome, solidify the impression of Kay's trauma. As the As the narrative progresses, Winning writes, Kay's emotional hardening is enacted by the gaps that open up within the narrative where serious, personally devastating facts are only partially spoken. But Kay's trauma is managed in two other ways that Winning recognizes. First, his use of gallows humor, which following Sarah Christopher, Winning takes to be a bona fide coping mechanism that helps sustain the resilience, health, and well-being of emergency services personnel. And second, through the narrative form his diary entries take. It is the narrative form that contains and performs the trauma of practice. Its snappy, caustic case vignettes, its relentlessly dark humor, its refusal to dwell on or even fully acknowledge the emotional realm. This refusal to dwell on or even fully acknowledge the emotional realm is not just a cue to the trauma in Kay's book. We should also take it as a signal of the shame at work within it. As Lucia Osborne Crowley has said rather powerfully, trauma leads to shame. Trauma determines the content of shame. Shame pushes the body into a response. The more I learn about the two, the more I am convinced of their deep connection to one another. Before we go further into what this means, however, I want to stick for a moment on the relationship between narrative form and humor suggested by Winning's essay, in particular how humor works in much of the novel. To take a relatively benign example, here is an entry dated Wednesday, 22nd March 2006. 3 a.m. attendance at labor ward triage. Patient RO is 25 years old and 30 weeks into her first pregnancy. She complains of a large number of painless spots on her tongue. Diagnosis, taste buds. What is happening here? We have a circumstance, a person, and a possible problem. Then deflation. The problem is taste buds. As Sigmund Freud describes it, we have a situation which leads the listener, here reader, to expect that the other will produce the signs of an affect, that he will get angry, complain, express pain, be frightened or horrified, perhaps even in despair, and the onlooker or listener or reader is prepared to follow his lead and call up the same emotional impulse in himself. That this emotional expectancy is disappointed. The other person expresses no affect but makes a jest. The expenditure on feeling that is economized turns into humorous pleasure in the listener. The emotional buildup to a strange, neglected tropical disease involving spots on the tongue dissolves into a wry smile about taste buds. This is important because, with a few notable exceptions, Kay's diary entries tend to end with just such pithy punchlines. No matter how horrific the situation described, we're always brought back to safe ground by the detached amusement of Kay's narrating voice. Crucially, we can distinguish this deployment of humor as a structuring principle of the narrative from the rather brutal jokes that pepper Kay's stories. Whereas jokes, as Freud notes, give us an opportunity to indulge in hostile or sexual feelings that we would usually repress, humor has an added element. It is, Freud writes, the triumph of narcissism, the ego's victorious assertion of its own invulnerability. It refuses to be hurt by the arrows of reality or to be compelled to suffer. While taste buds comment is a joke, in the sense that it cathects a hostile attack on the patient in a more acceptable form, we should also note how it, like the other final lines of Kay's vignettes, offers an opportunity for Kay to detach from these feelings and assert his own narrative invulnerability. In this sense, humor is not simply Kay's coping mechanism. In a much more targeted way, we might say it is the means by which he transfers his emphasis from his actual feelings to the regulation of those feelings, or from ego to superego. To quote Freud again, the jest made by humor is not the essential thing. It has only the value of a preliminary. The main thing is the intention which humor carries out, whether it is acting in relation to the self or other people. It means, look, here is the world, which seems so dangerous. It is nothing but a game for children. just worth making a jest about. Essentially, then, the joke becomes secondary to the underlying message, which is that the danger of the world can be explained away, even subordinated to the speaker, if only they have the right attitude. Now, really, all I mean by this is that Kay's punchlines shouldn't just be seen as efforts to deflect attention away from real sites of trauma. They are an adaptive narrative technique for rehabilitating the embarrassing, the shameful, and the traumatic events of his career into an order over which he has some control. At the same time, we should bear in mind Michael Billig's point that laughter and ridicule perform a disciplining function, often helping to maintain a social order. So even if we can be broadly sympathetic to Kay because his humor so obviously works to cover over feelings of shame, we should still be cognizant of his use of it to assert and defend precisely those forms of medical authority that are increasingly being questioned. Far from being an altogether liberatory or progressive text, there is a sense that this is going to hurt, is nostalgic in its use of humor, and it's nostalgic for a much older, more conservative understanding of medical authority premised on the division between an unknowing patient and a knowing doctor. At the same time, it is important to point out that Kay's recurrent use of humor because when it doesn't appear, that absence is itself significant. What of those instances then when he doesn't end an entry with a witty quip? The most obvious of these, of course, is the final entry of the book, which describes the sentinel emotional event that causes him to quit medicine. Faced with an undiagnosed placenta previa in a dead baby, a mother bleeding heavily from the uterus, Kay calls first one, then another consultant before a hysterectomy is performed. I start to write up my operation notes, he concludes the entry, but instead just cry for an hour. Rather than the usual deflation of expectation we have come to expect from his final lines, Kay lets his mask drop and maintains the signs of affect expected. So what happened? In the final chapter, titled Aftermath, he writes that it wasn't the baby's death or the mother's near miss, those had happened before. But this was different. It was the first time I was the most senior person on the ward when something terrible happened. It was on me and I had failed. Explanation wasn't good enough for me. I knew that if I'd been better, super diligent, super observant, super something, I might have gone into that room an hour earlier. That might have was inescapable. These are classic signs of shame, but why? To understand, let's do a bit of a dive into what shame is. Here I'll be using shame as an umbrella term to describe both emotions of self-assessment and negative self-conscious emotions. So including embarrassment, humiliation, chagrin, mortification, etc. Shame, as you no doubt already know, is a negative self-conscious emotion that tends to manifest as feelings of unworthiness, dirtiness, or taint in response to perceptions of being judged by others, either real or imagined. In light of these judgments, we take ourselves to be flawed in some crucial way, that some part of our core self is inadequate, inappropriate, or immoral. Kay hasn't just suffered a terrible experience, he should have been better. Thomas Sheff writes that shame signals a threat to one's social bonds or sense of belonging, but it also often involves some breakdown of our own self-image, where we are presented with evidence that we are not who we thought we were. What the book ends with then is the collapse of Kay's self-image as a doctor. I was a different doctor, he writes. Someone feeling shame or even just feeling the threat of shame will often go to great lengths to hide or avoid that shame, even when this means harming the self or going against reason. We see this when Kay raises the possibility of counseling. I should have had counseling. In fact, my hospital should have arranged it. But there's a mutual code of silence that keeps help from those who need it most. The code of silence that doctors might experience mental distress is thankfully being addressed, as demonstrated by recent series such as the Nocturnist podcast, Shame in Medicine, The Lost Forest, but has traditionally been a site of shame and taboo, especially because acknowledging shame can itself be experienced as shameful, because admitting to feelings of shame often produce uncomfortable feelings of exposure, vulnerability, and also because the suggestion that shame could be involved is often interpreted as an injunction that shame should be involved. It creates a shaming effect. It is telling then that shame is seldom mentioned in "this is going to hurt." Kay tends instead to refer to guilt, over which much more control can be asserted. I feel guilt for things I've done, but I feel shame for who or what I am. Kay's preference for guilt illustrates the way that shame, as the relational psychotherapist Patricia DeYoung puts it, disappears. Instead of feeling the emotional intensity of shame itself, she writes, a client may turn either to obsessive self-hatred or obsessive thoughts about what went wrong in interactions between self and others. They seldom actually identify shame as a problem. As Sandra Lee Barkey notes in a phenomenological discussion of shame in women's experience, some individuals may never identify their experiences containing shame and instead simply experience personal inadequacy and low self-regard. DeYoung's analysis of her clients' experiences concurs. She argues that some of her clients who suffer from chronic shame do not even know that they are experiencing it, and with debilitating frequency. These problems are only compounded in medical situations where patient vulnerability, physician self-presentation, power imbalances, and medico-legal concerns all play a significant role. Patients experience heightened states of vulnerability because illnesses make the body fragile, but also because clinical examinations frequently demand the patient be in a state of undress, compounding this exposure through a medicalized gaze that turns the body into a diagnostic object. Shame becomes particularly apparent when these experiences of vulnerability are interpreted as indicators of inadequacy or deficiency, as something intrinsically lacking in the self. The moral dimensions of illness, articulated so well by Susan Sontag in her work on illness and metaphor, transform feelings of vulnerability into shame-inducing self-perceptions about worth and value. Crucially, such perceptions prove longer lasting than the acute shame they provoke. They leave people shame-prone, more likely to respond to events as shame-inducing, and therefore more likely to avoid future medical care. Aaron Lazar, in his 1987 essay, Shame and Humiliation in the Medical Encounter, raises these points in order to counter the emphasis on caring, sympathetic attention, interest, positive regard, politeness, sensitivity, and trustworthiness, dignity, decorum, and respect in the training of physicians, with the paucity of accounts about their very real potential to shame and humiliate patients. Despite being rather dated, Lazar's article remains useful in establishing many of the causes of shame in clinical encounters. Lazar also schematizes how shame arises in such encounters as the interaction between a shame-inducing event, a vulnerable subject, and a social context. But perhaps most crucially, Lazar introduces circumstances in which shame and humiliation might arise for the physician as well. Like any other person, Lazar writes, the physician has a self-concept or standards that they strive to maintain, and some of these may be vulnerable to attack. Lazar lists 4 such circumstances that might lead to shame and humiliation for the physician: the failure to successfully diagnose a disorder, poor performance of a therapeutic procedure, the experience of disrespectful behavior, or an overly empathetic identification with the patient. But there is also more generally the condition that faces Kay. He simply thinks he is no longer the doctor he thought he was. So how do we identify shame in this medical memoir? One way is to follow the various professional lines that are asserted implicitly or explicitly about what a good doctor is. And I hopefully already pointed you to a couple of the ways in which Kay marks that line. Self presents as falling short. Another is to track the textual equivalents of defensive scripts. Donald Nathanson has proposed 4 scripts in the form of a compass of shame. Faced with shame, one can do one of 4 things, essentially. You can withdraw from the situation by cutting ties with the source of the shame. You can attack yourself and make yourself out as being a lesser being. You can avoid the situation by focusing on other things, or you can attack the other as a source of the shame. The defense Kay adapts to avoid the situation is humor. As he writes, first I couldn't talk about it, then it became something I just didn't talk about. When cornered, I would reach for my red nose and clown horn and bring out my anecdotes about objects and anuses and patients saying the funniest things. The book itself, we discover at the end, has been a litany of such redirections. Has Kay then been cornered this entire time? Such psychologisms scarcely make for good literary criticism, but they do highlight the difficulties of trying to write about shame as it appears in self-writing, whether memoir, autobiography, or confession. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in the Confessions, emphasizes the power of shame as such. Like this, I did not fear punishment, but I dreaded shame. I dreaded it more than death, more than the crime, more than all the world. I would have hid myself in the center of the earth. Invincible shame bore down on every other sentiment. As Paul de Man has famously observed, Rousseau's shame is primarily exhibitionistic. When Rousseau confesses to feeling shame at having stolen a ribbon and blamed it on the housemaid, what he really wanted, de Man argues, is the public scene of exposure which he actually gets. Shame at having done wrong disguises a deeper shame at wanting public attention for having done wrong. In the case of This Is Going to Hurt, there may be some of this desire for public attention, but it seems more apt to identify such underlying shame around Kay's ostensible reason for publishing it, to shed light on the conditions of junior doctors in the wake of the government attacks on them during the junior doctors strike of 2016. As he puts it, I have so much respect for those who work on the front line of the NHS because when it came down to it, I certainly couldn't. The book then emerges out of a shame at not being able to do more. In concluding this rather scattered collection of thoughts, I want to return to my earlier arguments about humor. I suggested that the book manages the emotional load of shame by rounding most vignettes off with a punchline that asserts Kay's control over the situation. But what is clear from reading the book as a whole is that these vignettes less an outright claim of control or authority than an effort to ward off the threat shame poses to social bonds and one's ideal self-representation. As Lucio Osborne Crowley puts it, shame needs silence to thrive. Silence is the oxygen of shame. Shame needs silence to survive. Shame itself is like water. It has the power to drown us. I'm determined to fight shame by talking about it in all its complexity. And I'm convinced that if we all talk more honestly about it, we will learn to swim. Key to talking about shame are representations of shame that can show both that it is not a unique experience and that conversations about shame need to be built into our understanding of the ideal doctor. It's the hope of the Shame in Medicine project that some of the work we're doing may push things in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rose, for this thought-provoking, fascinating talk on humor and shame. I found it really, really interesting and motivating.